Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully you all are having a wonderful day today. So when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about this little video that I found particularly interesting. I'm actually going to review a couple of videos by Mr. Fannon International Boxing because I found these series of videos very entertaining, or at least I found these conversations very interesting. And this first conversation that we're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about not only one of the current great fighters, in my opinion, Mr. Terence Crawford, but we're also going to be talking about, of course, the former #1 pound-for-pound king in all of boxing, Mr. Floyd Mayweather Jr. And in my opinion, Floyd Mayweather Jr., like I said, he is up there, in my opinion, as debatably the greatest boxer of all time. That means that he is up there with who? That means he's up there with Manny Pacquiao, Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler, Rocky Marciano, Muhammad Ali, Sweet Pea Pernell Whitaker, Roy Jones Jr., Carlos Monsoon, Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., Roberto Duran, and there may be a few other fighters that I may have not mentioned. Of course, Sugar Ray Robinson, and there may be a couple of other fighters that I maybe did not mention either. But point being is this, Floyd Mayweather Jr., in my opinion, he is a top 10 boxer of all time. I do believe him to be one of the greatest and the most skilled boxers that I personally have ever seen. And this conversation, all in all, is going to be about who would have potentially won in their prime between that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. and a Terence Crawford. And I think that actually is a very interesting fight because Terence Crawford, in my opinion, what he actually reminds me of, he reminds me of a bigger but slightly less skilled version of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. Like I said, just like if we were to compare to basketball, kind of like if you compare Kobe Bryant to that of a Michael Jordan. Because Kobe Bryant, he was a great player, but he was about, I would say, 65 to 75% of what Michael Jordan was. That's kind of how I view Terence Crawford when it comes to Floyd Mayweather Jr. I think that Terence Crawford, I think that he's naturally bigger than that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. Of course, he has even a little bit of a reach over that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. And I think that he probably had more power. But I do believe that Floyd Mayweather Jr. all around probably would have been the more skilled fighter, probably by about a level. But it would have been very particularly interesting because out of any style that I really have not seen Floyd Mayweather Jr. fight within his career, I've never really seen him face that Sweet Pea Pernell Whitaker style or really his own type of style. When it comes down to it, I've never seen him really face a fighter that was super duper fast with his feet or, overall. Well, I don't want to say that. That's not me trying to degrade Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s career. But what I am saying is that I never really seen him up against a fighter that, in my opinion, was also more of the defensive type and maybe the slick and fast mover overall that he kind of was. It would have been very interesting, in my opinion, to see Floyd Mayweather Jr. up against a boxer, for example, like that of an Araceli Lara. In my opinion, that would have been almost like a Sugar Ray Leonard versus Tommy Hearns sort of fight because Araceli Lara, of course, in his prime, at least when he was about 31 to 34 years old, he was a boxing genius. And I still think that Araceli Lara, he is a boxing genius. I just think that unfortunately, age has finally got to him. And of course, the Cubans, they don't always get, the best decisions on the scorecards when it comes down to it. But anyways, when it comes down to it all in all, we're going to review this video. And I'm going to be talking about who, in my opinion, would have won this fight in their prime, even though I maybe just revealed it to you. And I'm also going to be talking about who, in my opinion, maybe in their prime, considering all the all-time great boxers that have been throughout those lightweight divisions throughout the years, who, in my opinion, would have had the best shot to potentially beat that of a prime Floyd Mayweather Jr. So we're going to talk about it. Let's tune in.
All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fannon, and in this video, we're going to talk about something that Jeff Mayweather said, the uncle of Floyd Mayweather Jr., when he was asked about Errol Spence Jr., Terence Crawford, and then was asked about Terence Crawford versus the TBE, his nephew, Floyd Mayweather Jr. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fannon. We're going to talk about the current welterweight division, and I guess it's considered historical welterweight division now that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is no longer actively involved in fights. But there was an interview that is up on Fight Hype's network. You can go check it out over there. And it was an interview where Jeff Mayweather, who is the uncle of Floyd Mayweather Jr., was asked about the outcome, what he believed the outcome would be of Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr., and then that conversation leaked over into a conversation about Terence Crawford and Floyd Mayweather Jr. And I'm telling you, man, it was a very interesting answer from Jeff Mayweather. Before I get into that, though, first let me say welcome to the channel. Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button, like button, all of that good stuff. Share the video. If you're not subscribed, hit the bell icon so you can be notified of when we release more videos. But here we go. All right, so Jeff Mayweather, who was the uncle of Floyd Mayweather Jr., the brother of Roger Mayweather, rest in peace, and the brother of Floyd Mayweather Sr., who was the father of Floyd Mayweather Jr., and who has been a trainer of Floyd Mayweather Jr. during different periods of his life, obviously knows Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s game and his accomplishments and how good a fighter he is, as well as anybody else does, was asked about Terence Crawford, Floyd Mayweather Jr. Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence, and he answered the question believing that he would favor Terence Crawford in the fight over Errol Spence Jr. But then was asked whether or not
I personally would as well, and a certain amount of people may disagree, and we're going to be talking about that in another video as well. I personally would favor Terence Bud Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. Why is that? Because I think Terence Bud Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., I think that it is a 50-50 fight. But I do believe that Terence Bud Crawford does have the slight boxing skill advantage over that of an Errol Spence Jr. And, even though I don't want to strip away credit from Mr. Terence Bud Crawford if he does get the victory over Errol Spence Jr., but I do wonder, is Errol Spence Jr. the same fighter and boxer that he used to be, considering well I know that he was in that car accident? I do overall have a question about that because I'm not the only one that's had a question about that. And even though he has looked pretty phenomenal, even in his comebacks, he did look good against Danny Garcia. I think that he still completely outboxed Danny Garcia. There is something overall that maybe looks slightly off, but I could be wrong. We'll see overall what happens. I think that he did look still very fantastic in the Danny Garcia performance. Maybe I'm just overlooking it a little bit. I'm not sure. But we'll see overall what happens. But all in all, I think that Terence Bud Crawford, just looking at his Sean Porter performance, the one thing that Terence Bud Crawford does have to watch out for in the Errol Spence Jr. fight is he has to make sure, all in all, that he does not get hit with a combo or that he does not get hit with certain exchanges. Because sometimes, and certain commentators on my channel have brought this up as well whenever I've talked about this conversation, sometimes Terence Bud Crawford, when he gets in exchanges, he doesn't watch out for incoming punches and he may get hit by a returning punch. Now, Terence Crawford has never been officially knocked down, I believe, in his career, although I personally thought that he was knocked out against Aegis Kavalaskas. But Terence Crawford, especially with that chin, he does seem to be a sucker for the right hand. Sometimes Terence Bud Crawford, in my opinion, he needs to keep his chin a little bit more tucked. And Errol Spence Jr., he is very good in exchanges. He can be a very decent counterpuncher, especially with those hooks and uppercuts to the body. And he has some very, very good inside hooks. He also has a very decent left cross. Now, that actually may be an advantage for Terence Crawford because I don't usually see him get caught with left hands a whole lot. It's usually the right cross, but we'll see all in all what happens. It'll be interesting because that fight is pretty much going to be between the southpaw and the southpaw. But we'll see.
He believed that how Terence Crawford would do with Floyd Mayweather Jr. Now, the reason he was asked the question was because he said, Terence Crawford has got a really, he can basically do anything in the ring. He's got all kind of weapons, was a great fighter and all this and that, right? All of which I do believe is true. And then he was asked about Floyd, and he said, look, Floyd should pretty much, he insinuated that Floyd, without answering the question too clearly, that Floyd should win the fight, but was very clear in saying, but look, don't get me wrong, that's not going to be, Terence Crawford is no easy fight for Floyd Mayweather Jr., right? So he pretty much laid out that Terence Crawford, even if Floyd Mayweather Jr. is his prime, is such a good fighter that he would actually give a lot of difficulty and may have, and this is me reading into it, may have the potential to beat Floyd Mayweather Jr. when Floyd Mayweather Jr. was in his prime. Now, honestly,
I think that if you're asking me for my opinion, do I believe that Terence Bud Crawford would have defeated Floyd Mayweather Jr.? I believe that it would have been a very, very interesting fight. I think that Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Terence Crawford, I actually believe that they have a lot of similarities They both have extremely quick feet. They both, all in all, have extremely good hand speed. They're excellent counter punchers. Terence Crawford, of course. Terence Crawford, a lot of people, they always love to say, oh, well, he came from 135. He did come from 135, but I'm not going to say that he was ever really, really drained there. Somehow Terence Crawford was able to stay there for a little bit. But Terence Bud Crawford, even when he was at 140, he would rehydrate like 20 pounds heavier. So Terence Bud Crawford, he's just naturally bigger than that of what a Floyd Mayweather Jr. was. Now, in terms of reach and height, they're about the same in terms of that stature. But in terms of weight, Terence Bud Crawford would have been at least a solid 10 to 12 pounds bigger than that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. But the question is, all in all, who would have been the better boxer in terms of pure skill? In my opinion, just taking a look at prime Floyd Mayweather Jr., I think that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is the better skilled boxer, but it would have been interesting. In my personal opinion, with Terence Crawford have beat Floyd Mayweather Jr., I think that it would have been an interesting match, but I probably would have had to have favored Floyd Mayweather Jr. because Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s defense, in my opinion, was better than that of a Terence Bud Crawford. I think that a prime Floyd Mayweather, anyway, he at least has decent power. Of course, I think Terence Crawford has more power, but Terence Crawford, like I said, he reminds me overall of a weaker version of Floyd Mayweather Jr. He reminds me of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. if Floyd Mayweather Jr. overall had a little bit of a more leaky defense and, got a little bit more sloppy. Sometimes that's what Terence Bud Crawford reminds me of. So I think that Floyd, more than likely against the Terence Bud Crawford, I think that he probably would have coasted to a decision, in my opinion. I think Terence, maybe he could have pulled out maybe a solid 3 to 4 rounds. And some may say, wow, just 3 to 4 rounds. Yeah, in my opinion, just 3 to 4 rounds because I just think Terence Bud Crawford, even though he would have had the size a little bit over Floyd, and he does have that type of style that would be interesting, I don't know if he would quite have the defense to necessarily beat a Floyd Mayweather Jr. I think that his defense is a little bit too leaky. Now, I do think that he can beat an Errol Spence Jr. because both Terence Bud Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., when I watch them in both of their fights, they're both hittable. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like they get hit constantly or anything like that, but they are hittable. So, it is what it is. That's why, personally, I usually favor the fighter with the faster feet, the better head movement, and all in all, just the better all-around boxing skill, but especially the fighter with the better feet and overall that knows how to use their feet, and I think that Terence Bud Crawford does. Now, if you're asking me personally, who do I think would have beat Floyd Mayweather Jr. in the past, and some people may bring up a Sugar Ray Robinson, he's a little bit before my time. Now, of course, a lot of these fighters, to be honest with you, are before my time because, like I said, I was born in 1998. I'm 23 years old, but I know a lot about boxing history, but I haven't really, researched a lot on Sugar Ray Robinson, so I can't tell you. I heard that he was phenomenal, but in my opinion, there's two fighters, in my opinion, that would have had the best chance of defeating Floyd Mayweather Jr., and one would have been a 154-pounder, one would have been a 147-pounder, and both of them would have been in the generations of the Four Kings. In my opinion, it either would have been Tommy the Hitman Hearns, or it would have been Sugar Ray Leonard. Because in my opinion, to beat a Floyd Mayweather Jr., I think that you have to have decent hand speed. I think that you have to have decent punching power, overall to somewhat keep him honest. And I think all in all that you're going to have a little bit of that slick style. Now, some people may ask, well, what about Roberto Duran? What about Marvin Hagler? Or maybe Canelo Alvarez, who of course is paving his greatness in his own way. Do I believe that any of those fighters, or maybe a Chavez Sr., do I believe that any of those fighters would it be to Floyd Mayweather Jr.? I think all those fighters are all-time great fighters, no doubt about it. But no, personally, I do not believe that they would have beat Floyd Mayweather Jr. Why do I believe that they would not beat Floyd Mayweather Jr.? Because I think a Marvin Hagler versus Floyd Mayweather Jr. fight, I think that it would have looked exactly like the Canelo Alvarez versus overall Floyd Mayweather Jr. fight. That's what I personally believe. I've already said this when it comes to the possibility of there being a Canelo versus Floyd Mayweather Jr. rematch. In my opinion, to beat a Floyd Mayweather Jr., you're not only going to have to be an extraordinary fighter, but Floyd has that very tricky style, and on top of that, he has a 72-inch reach. He's about 5'8", extremely quick feet, extremely quick hands. You're not going to be able to be bigger than him like a Marvin Hagler or a Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, and all in all, just be able to outspeed him. And I just don't see a guaranteed way that Canelo or Marvin Hagler would have been able to outbox that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. And even if they pressure him all the way, I'm not necessarily sure if they would have been able even to outpressure him the whole entire way. Now, when we talk about Roberto Duran, I think was a fantastic boxer for his day, but not only in stature was he smaller than that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr., but I don't know if he would have been able to compete with him skill for skill, and a certain amount of people may disagree with me. That's not saying that he was not extremely skilled, but, I think that more than likely Floyd probably would have been able to be, outreaching him. I believe that Floyd is naturally taller than him and outreached him as well. I don't think that Roberto Duran would have been able to beat Floyd more than likely because Floyd, in terms of stature, in terms of height and reach, I believe was a little bit bigger than that of a Duran. And it's the same thing with Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. Chavez Sr., I believe that the highest weight division that he tried to win a title at was either, I think it was 140. So Chavez Sr., he was even a little bit outranged at 140, I believe. So I believe that Floyd Mayweather Jr. more than likely probably would have outboxed him as well. And of course, some people may ask, well, what about Sweet Pea Pernell Whitaker? Sweet Pea Pernell Whitaker was one of the greatest defensive fighters of all time. Very, very slick. Extremely slick fighter, extremely great fighter, but I don't think that Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker would have beat Floyd either. In my opinion, to beat Floyd, not only are you going to have to be a decent athlete and an extraordinary fighter, but you're going, like I said, you gotta have decent punching power. You have to have decent hand speed, and all in all, you have to have some sort of advantages over him. That's why, in my opinion, Sugar Ray Leonard, who would have been a little bit bigger than Floyd Mayweather Jr. or a Tommy Hearns, who had actually very close hand speed to that of a Sugar Ray Leonard and excellent punching power. To be honest with you, Tommy Hearns actually might have been the best bet, in my opinion, to actually beat a Floyd Mayweather Jr. Now, does that mean, in my opinion, that Tommy Hearns is greater than some of the other fighters that I listed off? No, because he lost a lot of those bigger fights. But at the end of the day, I think that Tommy Hearns, with his athleticism, with his speed, and all in all, with his build, I think that he would have gave Floyd Mayweather Jr. a hell of a time. Now, Tommy Hearns, he didn't always have, Floyd Mayweather-like defense in the biggest fights of his career. But it would have been interesting to see how Floyd Mayweather Jr. would have been able to handle someone like a Tommy Hearns, someone who had a 78-inch reach, someone all in all that, was decently bigger than him. That would have been very interesting. And also Sugar Ray Leonard as well.
I think that's a little bit of a misnomer talking about Floyd Mayweather Jr. in his prime and Terence Crawford in the same breath, because Terence Crawford, I do believe, is really a welterweight. Somebody that is a bigger guy than.
I agree. Terence Bud Crawford is a natural welterweight. This is my opinion. I actually think that Floyd Mayweather Jr. fought slicker boxers with better defense than that of a Terence Bud Crawford. Or I wouldn't say 100% slicker, but fighters with a very great offensive skill set, but that also were defensively responsible, like a Miguel Cotto. Miguel Cotto was one of the slickest fighters that Floyd Mayweather Jr. ever fought. Now, Floyd overall, he thought going into that fight that Miguel Cotto, that, I'm sure he probably thought that he was going to be somewhat of a challenge. But, heading into that fight, I think that Cotto at the time, well, maybe debatably, a lot of people, of course, would argue that De La Hoya was greater than that of a Miguel Cotto. To me, they're kind of on a similar level, but I would understand if you argue De La Hoya over Cotto. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, when Cotto and Mayweather happened, Cotto gave Mayweather all sorts of hell. And the reason why he gave him all sorts of hell is because Cotto didn't necessarily compete with Floyd Mayweather Jr. in terms of defensive responsibility or in terms of hand speed, but he is somewhat defensively responsible. He's a very intelligent boxer. Miguel Cotto is someone that is a natural welterweight. He rehydrates, I believe, at around 160 pounds. I've heard people tell me that he rehydrates more than that, but I doubt it. I think Miguel Cotto, he's a person that he's at least a natural welterweight. He don't rehydrate that much. I believe he's about the same weight as a Terence Bud Crawford. That actually would have been a great fight in my opinion. A prime Miguel Cotto versus Terence Bud Crawford. I'm actually not sure who would have won that fight. To be honest with you, if I would have made a bet on it, I think that maybe even Miguel Cotto possibly could have won that fight. And the reason why I say that is because Cotto, in my opinion, I actually believe that he was the better defensive boxer. And his power, he was the prime Miguel Cotto. A lot of people who don't remember prime Miguel Cotto was even more powerful than that of an Errol Spence Jr. This dude, if he hit you with this left hook, if he killed you with those body shots, man. For those of you overall that don't know how good a prime Miguel Cotto was, or even a little bit later on, go check out Miguel Cotto when he completely whooped this dude's ass. I don't ever think that this dude overall was ever A+, but he was at least a decent fighter. Go check out when Miguel Cotto totally toyed with this one Mexican fighter, Alonzo Gomez. I believe that was his fight right before he lost to that first fight to Antonio Margarito. Miguel Cotto was a fantastic fighter.
Floyd Mayweather, and I think the best of Terence Crawford probably is at the 140, 130, 147 pound range, where Floyd Mayweather Jr., I think the absolute best in the prime of him was at 130 and 135 pounds, right? So I just think when we talk about...
I would say Floyd is around a natural 135, 140 pounder. Some would debate, of course, in terms of weight. Now, in terms of weight, he's probably a natural 135 pounder, maybe 140. But in terms of, if you want to also combine his reach and his height, he's probably around a natural 140 pounder.
when we talk about the prime of them, I think it's a little bit, it's a little bit off. I think that Terence Crawford is naturally a bigger guy and the closer thing to a natural welterweight. But that is a lot of praise being heaped on by Jeff Mayweather, and I think it's something that people might want to really take seriously. Like in my opinion, I would say that I think that if you had Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Terence Crawford and they were both at welterweight at the same time, I think that that would be the hardest fight that Floyd Mayweather Jr. probably has in his entire career. Now, because I've never seen
I think that it would be a tough fight, but I just think that Terence Crawford, I just think that his defense is too leaky, and I think that he just leaves himself for too many open punches. And Terence Crawford, he has decent defense, but he don't really have A-plus defense. I've seen Floyd fight fighters, in my opinion, with better defense. Like, in my opinion, Mr. Miguel Cotto. In my opinion, Canelo Alvarez actually right now, he actually has better. Like I said, Canelo in the world of boxing today, he is the best all-around defensive fighter. In my opinion, even better than Crawford or Earl Spence Jr. Miguel Cotto, very, very good boxer that he fought. I'm trying to think of like another, of course, Manny Pacquiao as well. Although he didn't necessarily have an A-grade defense at times, but I'm trying to think of other boxers. Some people may mention Sugar Shane Mosley, but in my opinion, Sugar Shane Mosley, great boxer, extraordinary athlete. I think that Shane Mosley kind of relied a little bit too much sometimes on his athleticism, the overall, than excuse me, than what he had in A-grade defense. Because sometimes if you take a look at Shane Mosley in his bigger fights, he would get hit a little bit more than he probably should have. Because Shane wasn't always a guy that would keep his hands up extremely well. You can take a look at that in the Floyd Mayweather Jr. fight, the Miguel Cotto fights, and a couple of the other fights that he was in. But it would have been interesting to see Terence Crawford versus Floyd.
Floyd Mayweather Jr. lose, and I got a lot of respect for him. I might give him the edge to the fight over Terence Crawford just because he's so much more fun. He's not so much more. He's very, very fundamentally sound.
I wouldn't say so much more, but he's decently, like I said, he has decent fundamentals over Terence Crawford. Like, there's a clear edge. Like it's a 70-30 edge in my opinion. In favor of Floyd Mayweather. Like I said, Terence Crawford, he would have had the slight advantage in reach, weight, and power. Actually, probably a decent advantage in power, at least at that way, because Floyd, especially later on in his career, he was not known as a one-shot knockout artist anyway. Terence, let me say this. He's not really known as a one-shot knockout artist necessarily like what a Roy Jones Jr. was, or I don't even know if his power really is on the same level as that of a Canelo Alvarez maybe, but, Terence, he can knock you out. If he can hurt you if he hits you,
Very, very smart fighter, but there's a lot of things about Terence Crawford that can cause Floyd Mayweather Jr. a world of trouble. If you look at, like, for example, one of the fights that I look at, if I would, when you try to project those type of things, is I would say, look at, like, consider Terence Crawford to be like, Zab Judah 3.0. I wouldn't say 2.0. I would say Zab Judah 3.0. A guy that's fighting in southpaw, somebody who's got power in both.
I can somewhat see where you're coming from because Zab Judah was a very quick southpaw. Actually, if you take a look at one of the more difficult fights in Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s career, not just Miguel Cotto or Jose Luis Castillo or Marcos Maidana, Zab Judah, and this is why I believe that in order to beat Floyd Mayweather Jr., I think that you would have had to have that slick style. I think all in all that you have to have a Sugar Ray Leonard or Tommy Hearns type of style with their build. You have to be bigger than him, in my opinion. You're not going to beat him if you're smaller than him, in my opinion. You have to at least be somewhat of the same size, kind of like what a Zab Judah was. Zab Judah gave Floyd Mayweather Jr. hell. In fact, actually, in that fight, I believe he hit Floyd Mayweather Jr. with the right hook. Some people say that Zab Judah's foot touched Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s foot, but when I took a look at it, it looked like he actually knocked him down. The referee called it a slip, but it looked like a legitimate knockdown to me. It was a right hook. I believe it was in the second round. And Zab Judah, I thought, got the knockdown. Zab Judah was giving Floyd Mayweather Jr. hell in the first half of that fight. But like Zab Judah, like Zab Judah ways, he would always crumble in the second half of the fight. He never could win any of his big fights.
Both hands, somebody that is, can be an aggressive fighter and somebody that is a very, very good counterpuncher. But I just think Terence Crawford is a better fighter than Zab Judah. He's bigger, stronger, and I think that he would cause.
I agree. Terence Bud Crawford he is a better fighter than Zab Judah. More power. I wouldn't say that he's has better hand speed than Zab Judah, but that's because Zab Judah is naturally smaller. Better boxing IQ, better chin, in my opinion. Just better all around boxer.
you know,
way better adaptability as well. Terence Crawford, like I said, he does have great adaptability. That's why he's able to adapt so well in some of these fights, especially in the second half of the fight. Zab Judah, if you really put the pressure on him in the second half of the fight and you put him under the skillet, if you put him under the fire, he oftentimes would melt. Terence Bud Crawford, one thing I'll say about him, he has at least came up big every single time that I have seen him so far in his career. So I'll give him that much credit.
I think he would be a significantly more difficult matchup than for Floyd Mayweather Jr. than Zab Judah was, or if you look like maybe the fight with Oscar De La Hoya, I think that Terence Crawford is probably
to give Floyd Mayweather Jr. in my opinion, you have to have a great hand speed because every single fighter that ever gave Floyd Mayweather Jr. Trouble, usually, at least when he was in the latter part of his career, they usually had a very, very similar thing, hand speed. Whether it be Zab Judah, Oscar De La Hoya, even at the older version of his career. A prime Oscar De La Hoya versus a prime Floyd would have been very interesting. And I know some Floyd fans are going to say, oh, what are you talking about? Oscar wasn't his prime. Not really. I mean, Oscar was at a decent point in his career. Don't get me wrong. He probably was like an A to A minus fighter at the time, but Oscar did not have the same athleticism that he had used to. If it would have been the same Oscar that, say, fought Felix Tito Trinidad, Floyd, I still think, probably could have pulled out that fight just because Oscar, he never was known for A-grade head movement, but his hand speed, Oscar De La Hoya was one of the fastest fighters ever.
A better fighter than Oscar De La Hoya was at 147. So, I mean, I'm one of these guys, man, I'll give credit where credit is due. If you look at it, and I like to look at fights from a stylistic standpoint, because, styles make fights. Fighters don't make fights, styles make fights. So where I believe that Errol Spence Jr. stylistically is a very, very difficult match for Terence Crawford, and quiet as kept, Errol Spence Jr. would be a very, very difficult stylistic matchup for Floyd Mayweather Jr. if Floyd Mayweather Jr. is welterweight.
I've heard that in sparring sessions once again that Errol Spence Jr. gave Floyd Mayweather Jr. hell, but I think in an actual fight, in a professional fight, I believe that more than likely, when Floyd takes him at 100%, I think that Errol Spence, even though for how terrific of a boxer he is, I think that he's a little bit too slow for Floyd Mayweather Jr. I think Floyd would have been able to take advantage of that. Like I said, if you're going to beat Floyd, you have to have around the same foot speed as him. So like I said, it would have been a Sugar Ray Leonard, a Tommy Hearns, in my opinion. Those are pretty much the only two fighters that I can really think of. That doesn't mean that there's not other great fighters that maybe could have not gave him competitive fights, but you have to have very similar, foot speed to Floyd Mayweather Jr., or you're not going to touch him. You're not going to touch him consistently. And on top of that, you have to have usually decent hand speed.
Consistency and the work rate that he has, I think Terence Crawford, his counterpunching and his instinctual, just natural fighting talent and power would cause a lot of problems with Floyd Mayweather. And also, at welterweight, Floyd Mayweather Jr. is not a knockout artist. So
that is true. Terence Bud Crawford, he probably could have took some of the Floyd shots. At least what I'm saying is that he probably would have not got knocked out, but who knows? I don't know. But also Terence Bud Crawford, he would have the power advantage.
But he does have enough power to keep people off of him. But I would be interested to see if Terence Crawford took the approach of trying to win rounds with Floyd Mayweather Jr. That I say he may actually have the ability to pull it off, man. But this is not some scenario where I'm saying, yeah, if you put him up there, I would pick Terence Crawford over Floyd Mayweather. But I think it's close enough that if they actually got into the ring together, that a fight could go the wrong way for Floyd. And just say if they fought 10 times, Floyd Mayweather Jr. may win 6. Terence Crawford may win 4, man. But Terence Crawford, just to have that hesitancy in the answer from Jeff Mayweather is a lot of respect to Terence Crawford. And also, this is the same.
I think the Mayweather camp has a whole lot of respect for Terence Bud Crawford. And I think the reason why Floyd Mayweather Jr. says a lot of the times that Terence Bud Crawford is the number one pound per pound, is that he has a lot of respect for him because Terence Bud Crawford, I think that Floyd realizes that Terence Bud Crawford is basically this generation's Floyd Mayweather in terms of the style. I can't compare him quite to Floyd because he has nowhere near the same amount of a resume as a Floyd Mayweather Jr., and I don't think he's even as talented or as skilled as what a prime Floyd was. But, Terence Bud Crawford, he's, I can understand why Floyd Mayweather Jr., why he sees a lot of himself in Terence Bud Crawford, and I agree.
This is not unusual if you really listen carefully to Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s family, specifically Floyd Mayweather Sr., when he was asked by somebody about what he thought Floyd Mayweather Jr. would do with a fighter like Sugar Ray Robinson, he was, again, never going to say that the guy, Floyd can't beat somebody. But when you look at the expression on his face and how non-committal he is in the answer, you know that he takes that as a serious threat, man. And I'm not one of these guys, and I don't think that anybody should be, that just necessarily just labels a guy the greatest ever and thinks that he has nobody out there that could cause him problems. But that was just really, really interesting, and a lot of credit to Terence Crawford. Obviously, for Jeff Mayweather to answer the question like that, he thinks the world of the dude. And anyway, but my hat goes off to him. That's what I think. You let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.
Anyways, I thought that was a very interesting conversation. But in my opinion, like I said, to beat Floyd Mayweather Jr., in my opinion, I think that you have to be around the same size as him, or at least have similar foot speed and similar hand speed. And, if you don't have similar hand speed and similar foot speed, in my opinion, it's going to be very, very hard to outbox Floyd Mayweather Jr. unless you have A-grade boxing IQ and overall just punching ability. So, in my opinion, like I said, the two best styles, in my opinion, that would have been the best, possibility to beat that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. in history would have been either a Sugar Ray Leonard or probably a Thomas Hearns. One of those two, because they would have had a little bit of size and power advantage over Floyd Mayweather Jr. Well, in the case of Tommy Hearns, a big power advantage when it comes down to it. Even prime Floyd never had the type of power that Tommy Hearns did. But when it comes down to it, all in all, it would have been interesting to see Floyd against those two fighters. I think that, once again, Roberto Duran, Chavez Sr., Marvin Hagler, all those guys, they would have been great fighters as well to face up against Floyd. But I think to beat Floyd, that, now some people may also bring up Manny Pacquiao, so some may say, well, you say that he never fought a slickster, but, all in all, he fought Sugar Shane Mosley and Manny Pacquiao, Miguel Cotto. Some of these fighters could be decently slick. Like Manny Pacquiao, he can be decently slick, but in terms of slick, I'm talking about a person that, it usually tends to be a little bit more defensive, a fighter, all in all, that, maybe tend to be a little bit more defensive, or, now don't get me wrong, Manny Pacquiao does have very, very quick feet, but I think all in all, also to beat Floyd Mayweather Jr., I think that you're going to also be gifted with a decently long reach, or at least for your size. Like Sugar Ray Leonard, I believe, had a 74-inch reach. Tommy Hearns had a 78-inch reach. It would have been interesting to see how Floyd would have been able to handle that, because in my opinion, if you don't have the reach advantage over Floyd, going to be very, very, very hard overall to try and outbox him. But, that's just my opinion. But, it would have been interesting to see Floyd up against these fighters. But, his place, of course, is already secured in history. In my opinion, is one of the greatest boxers of all time. In my opinion, he certainly is top 10. But that's just my view. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.